Good morning. Welcome to the MV Book Festival 2025. Thank you for coming and for supporting these authors and for your appreciation of great writing. We are happy that you are here. The way to support this festival and the authors that participate in it is to buy their books at the Bunch of Grapes bookstore tent located in the middle of the field at the festival. Not on Amazon, not in your Kindle, but buy it here and go meet the authors and have them sign your book afterwards. Book signings will follow each session throughout the festival, and today's authors will be signing the books immediately following this session in the book signing tent, which is right behind us. Also, don't go hungry. We have food. Please buy it and support these island vendors. Water is available throughout the festival site thanks to Island Source. Stay hydrated. If you need anything, see one of our ushers or go to the information tent. The author will take questions at the end of the session. When asking a question, please line up over here at the microphone and ask a question. Do not make long statements. Let others have a chance to speak and let the author speak also. This morning we are so pleased to have Stephen Hahn discussing his book, Illiberal America, with Book Festival board member Patricia Sullivan. Stephen is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian whose new book, Illiberal America, uncovers the powerful, deep-seated illiberalism that is part of the American bedrock. Hahn is a professor of history at New York University and a specialist on the history of the 19th century U.S. and the comparative history of slavery and emancipation. His 2004 work, A Nation Under Our Foot, received multiple awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in History and the Bancroft Prize in History. Patricia Sullivan is the William Arthur Fairey II Professor of History at the University of South Carolina. Her work focuses on the United States history with an emphasis on African American experience, politics, race relations, and the history of the Civil Rights Movement. Her most recent book, Justice Rising: Robert Kennedy's America in Black and White, explores Robert Kennedy's public life in relation to the Civil Rights Movement and racial turmoil in the 1960s. Please join me in welcoming them to the festival.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I just want to give a shout out. She's not here, but to Sue Ellen and the team that put all of this together on the ground. It's been great, really terrific. And thanks to all of you for turning out this morning. It's really a great pleasure to be here with my longtime friend and colleague, Stephen Hahn. Oh, here, hi guys. And to talk about this book. I've been teaching American history for a long time, and this Illiberal America is one of the most important books I've read in recent years. It's really going to impact how I teach the survey this fall. With its fresh questions and lens on America's past, so essential to getting our bearings now. James Baldwin, a favorite quote from Baldwin in an interview with Studs Terkel, said in 1961, "If you don't know what happened behind you, you have no idea what's going on around you." And and Steve's book, again, you know, we're focused on Trump, personalities, the Trump voter. I said to my friends, which one? There were 77 million. You know, what are the forces? I mean, who are we as Americans, and how did we come to this moment, and what's a way of imagining our way forward? With Steve, I'd like us to start with you briefly describing what you mean by illiberalism.
I will. First of all, thank you all for being here. This is really a wonderful book festival and something that could only take place on Martha's Vineyard. So it's a real honor for me to be here. And I can't tell you how impressed I am with not only the people who are here, but how it's been put together. Illiberalism doesn't necessarily come up to the enjoyment level of this festival. But let me talk a little bit about this. In some ways, I've been writing about this my whole scholarly life, but mostly from the point of view of those who have been on the receiving end of illiberalism, humble white folk, humble black folk. But because of what was taking place in the last decade, I thought that this would be a useful intervention for me and maybe for readers as well. Let me say a little bit about how I understand illiberalism. For one thing, it's a set of ideas and practices, perspectives that precede liberalism historically. I understand that that's a little weird because how can you have illiberalism before liberalism? But in many ways, I see it tethered to an early modern and feudal world that was redeployed in many respects in North America. To me, illiberalism is about inequality. It's about hierarchy of gender and race and nationality. It's about a desire for cultural and or religious homogeneity. It's about marking out internal as well as external enemies and using expulsion or exclusion as a way of dealing with them. It's about what you could call a particularist idea about rights, a limited idea about rights, meaning you may have rights over there, but you don't carry those rights with you over here. Whether it's defined by neighborhood, whether it's defined by state, whether it could be defined by nation as well. It rejects a universal notion of rights bearing. Certainly, illiberalism accepts the use of violence as a means of attaining as well as maintaining power. And one of the things that's really, I think, characteristic of it is the will of the community, however the community is defined, over the rule of law. The community expresses itself, administers popular justice in its own name, regardless of what the official rules are. Now, one thing I will say is that this is not just a continuity story, that illiberalism, illiberal regimes, illiberal forms of governance can be of many types, as can illiberal movements. I mean, they can be nationalist movements, separatist movements that have democratic aspects to them, but only for the people who are seeking acceptance or seeking exclusion. They can obviously be the basis of autocratic regimes. They can be tied up in regimes of slaveholding, servitude, patriarchalism, and it kind of reconstitutes itself and reconfigures itself over time historically. So one of the things I try to do in the book is to find moments that it not only expresses itself, but is transforming itself so that we can have a better sense of the difference between what's true in the 17th century, when most people in North America were indigenous, in servitude, or enslaved, and a modern world of the 21st century when those relationships have changed. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Excellent. In a wonderful interview you did with Ezra Klein, you were asked at the end to mention a couple of books that you'd recommend. And a book many have heard of, but de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And you write so powerfully about the 1830s, the Jacksonian democracy, the period when de Tocqueville was observing, writing, and you talk about Lincoln's concerns that emerged in the 1830s. So how did your reading of de Tocqueville for this work sort of resonate?
Yeah, Tocqueville, interestingly enough, Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which was published in 2 volumes in the 1830s, kind of disappeared from view for a long time, and it was sort of revitalized during the Cold War. Right? I mean, it was republished then. It was reviewed in the American Historical. I mean, that's interesting in its own right. What I try to do in the book was pick out those moments in the past that we tend to associate with the development of liberalism and try to look at how it was hedged in, complicated, undermined by illiberal tendencies. And one of the periods I picked out was the 1830s. Now, as some of you know, the 1830s is a period that we tend to call Jacksonian democracy. It's the era of the common man. And in truth, it is a time when the franchise was being expanded to white men who didn't own property. right? And so it seemed to be one of the many moves in a democratic direction, not the last one, and has often been celebrated as a moment of America. This is where American exceptionalism really took hold. But the 1830s is a time that's marked by widespread expulsions. The most horrific is of Native people, right, who were expelled from their lands east of the Mississippi out to something that was known as Indian Territory in the trans-Mississippi West. And it was the only territory that was created at that time in the United States that was not imagined as moving towards statehood. I mean, it was sort of an imagined space out there, but that wasn't the only. African Americans were being, in effect, encouraged to sort of self-deport through what they call colonization. The American Colonization Society was trying to push the ultimate end of slavery by encouraging people who were liberated to leave the country and go to Liberia as one destination. Also, black communities in the North, where slavery had been the process of being abolished, were being attacked. Abolitionists were being mobbed. And in addition to this, Mormons, Catholics, I mean, Mormons ended up in the Great Lakes area after Joseph Smith and his brother were killed in Illinois, and they had already been run out of New York and Ohio and Missouri. It was sort of a case in point. Masons, I mean, this whole idea of the people who didn't fit into an idea of what you might call a white Christian republic were being, challenged, run out, excluded, or expelled.
And
So it's sort of an illiberal democracy that emerges. Now, of course, the overwhelming number of people of African descent were enslaved, right? They had no standing in either civil or political society, and yet they were a foundation of the American working class because they were producing cotton, and cotton was being turned into textiles, and it was the driving force of the Industrial Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic. So we have to think about that and about the fact that the other basis of the textile workforce was women and children who also didn't have rights or had very limited rights. So, we tend to think about part of American exceptionalism is the United States industrializing with an enfranchised working class. But that ain't true.
and Tocqueville's concern about tyranny.
I'm sorry, I kind of got away from Tocqueville. So I went back to read Tocqueville. It's a classic book, and it has been associated with what was essential about and different about American democracy, what is distinctive. And, Tocqueville came to the United States actually to observe the American new prison system, because penitentiaries only came into being at the turn of the 19th century. And he wanted to go back to France to report on what he found. And he actually wrote an extended, very detailed report. But in the process, he also wrote Democracy in America. And generally speaking, it's seen as a description of a kind of robust freedom and democracy grounded in associations and communities and so on. But if you read it carefully, there are a lot of warnings. He talked about the lack of sort of protections against tyranny. He said that the United States had the least independence of mind and the less freedom of expression than any place he had ever been. And he thought that if the United States ever gave up its republic, it would descend very quickly into despotism with no stop along the way from monarchy. He imagined people giving up their rights and submitting to one man, as he put it. And so there's this mixture in the book, which is on the one hand something that seems very appealing, but he also talked about communities taking matters into their own hands, sort of expressing their will and turning on those who threaten community life. And so when I read, and then Lincoln at the end of the 1830s gave this remarkable speech in Springfield, Illinois, where he warned about mob rule, mob rule undermining the goals of the founders, and he wasn't only talking about the South. Tocqueville talked about domestic dictatorships in the South as being particularly strong, but Lincoln was talking about mob rule because he knew about it. In southern Illinois, Elijah Lovejoy, who was a radical abolitionist, was murdered, and many other abolitionists were run off. And there was only one example of mob rule, and so he was warning his audience that if we do not basically make the rule of law central to the way in which the republic is organized, this is where we're going. And so it's a very sobering view of a time that we kind of pass over as, yes, this is another this is our redemption story. It's another step in the direction of, you know, the advance of democratic ideas and practices.
Excellent. You know, the scope of this book is sweeping, and as Steve's indicated, it's textured. Historical context is critical to understanding the development, the emergence, the fluidity. So I want to skip it, but the Gilded Age and Progressive Period, Margaret Sanger, for birth control and supporting eugenics, just the complexity and how it reflects the times. But I want to move ahead to the World War I period, because, you know, today we're saying, oh, fascism's coming to America. And the relationship between what's happening in the United States around the war, the Red Scare after the war, the 1920s, and how that interchange between here and beginnings of fascism in Europe. Could you expand on that a bit, and how people are looking to the U.S.?
Yeah, you know, I've always resisted saying, you know, historians are often asked, you know, what is this like? You know, what period in the past is this like? And it sort of reflects a kind of pendulum view of history that moves in this direction. And I don't buy that. I've never bought that. But I would say if there's any period in the past that this seems to be resonant with, I would say the 1920s, which is an incredibly reactionary time. I mean, the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was the largest social movement in the United States. It had followers up through into the Supreme Court of the United States, people who were either members or kind of fellow travelers. There were many states and localities in which the Klan basically, there was no political party because they didn't need one. And prohibition was one of the driving forces that the Klan was able to attach itself to, which of course was directed against immigrants. The 1924 Immigration Act, which was the first national Immigration Act, set quotas, and particularly very low quotas from people not only from Asia but from Southern and Eastern Europe, who were called the Chinese of Europe, meaning they were unassimilable and that they tended to procreate. And this is part of the appeal of eugenics. One of the things that struck me dealing with the 20s and the period immediately before this, World War I, was the ways in which even progressivism was moving in, you know, illiberal directions. I call the chapter Modernizing Illiberalism. And here were people who were abandoning many of the ideas and sensibilities of the 19th century, which they thought were inadequate for the 20th century. And instead, they were interested in social engineering, about using the state in order to perfect society. Now, as Pat mentioned, eugenics becomes incredibly popular across the progressive spectrum. And I gotta say, you know, I knew the literature on progressivism really well, and eugenics was not really centered in it, and I couldn't understand why that was. It was just sort of seen as kind of an offshoot, not really what things were about. And so eugenics, the idea that politics ought to be really the province of well-educated and well-trained people, disparaging of what was known as Jeffersonian democracy of the 19th century. Remember, too, this is the time of Jim Crow, of segregation, of disfranchisement, all of which is upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. It's about overseas warfare and colonialism organized around ideas of race. The Supreme Court, the idea is, well, the people who you're conquering have any rights? And the Supreme Court said, well, not really. There's a whole package, including a corporatism, that emerges really powerfully during World War I. And I would say in some ways, and also in the 1920s, Benito Mussolini was incredibly popular in the United States. He was sort of held up as someone who pulled himself up by his bootstraps and was a powerful leader, which was seen as what was necessary as the United States really was becoming a modernized country. I mean, he was actually invited by the American Legion to their annual convention in the early 1920s. He didn't come, so they went to see him and brought him a cowboy hat. The American Legion was, the American Legion was part of a whole paramilitary constellation of repression. In fact, they likened themselves to his black shirts. I mean, they were interested in crushing radicals, labor organizers, and anybody who pushed back against the idea of really a white Christian America. But, there was a lot of interchange between scientists in the United States and people interested in eugenics, especially in Nazi Germany. Hitler himself and the Nazis actually thought that the racial laws in the United States were too rigid, even though he saw them potentially as a roadmap for what he was interested in doing, not to mention the conquest of the Trans-Mississippi West and the suppression of indigenous people as kind of a version of the breathing space he was interested in Eastern Europe. So in some ways, it seemed to me that although we don't talk about it, it was almost as if it kind of was it kind of was an early fascist set of mentalities and ideas that would be intensified in Europe. And it helps us understand really what we were potentially up against in the 1920s, and how when Roosevelt was elected in 1932 and was about to take power in the depths of the Great Depression, that there were a lot of people, including liberals like Walter Lippmann, who were telling him he really needed to take dictatorial power, that this was the only way that the challenges of the Depression could be taken on. So, in some ways, it is important to think about the global context for all of this, and not to see the United States necessarily as the exception, but the United States as part of a much larger political landscape.
And in your book talking about the 1924 Immigration Act, the New York Times endorsed it with an editorial titled "Preserving the American Race." So the breadth of this and the nature of the support. There was a question that came up when you were talking, but I'll come back to it. Forgot it. But again, moving forward, because we have a short time. Another chapter that's particularly, I think, surprising to people is Steve's chapter on the 1960s, the other 1960s, which many of us associate with civil rights struggle, which is certainly important. It culminates with important legislation. Women's movement comes out of the 60s, all these progressive developments. But the conservative movement and what comes together during the 60s is sort of a pivot point for conservatism.
Again, it was sort of picking a time that we think about one way and trying to suggest that there's a lot else going on that potentially entangles and complicates what we think is going on. Remember, in 1964, there's a presidential election, Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater, right? And Barry Goldwater gets crushed. And everyone thought that was the last gasp of conservatism. That might have been Richard Hofstadter, who was, a pretty eminent historian, thought that was the end of the Republican Party. But for people on the right, Goldwater was the beginning. He was the springboard. And the John Birch Society, which was a ground game for Goldwater, Young Americans for Freedom. And I think a figure who kind of gets, doesn't get the attention he deserves, even though you may not want to give him attention, is George Wallace. Now, George Wallace, as you know, became governor of Alabama and gave this awful speech, his inauguration, segregation now, segregation tomorrow. That was in January. By the fall, he was on a college tour of the North and Midwest and Far West. He was talking to college audiences, and he was kind of bantering with them, but he was honing an interesting language of grievance. Not talking about race per se, but talking about the overreach of the federal government. He talked about state rights. And he decided that he was going to run for the Democratic nomination in 1964. And he announced his candidacy not in Alabama, but in Wisconsin, where Joseph McCarthy's district was. And when he entered the primary, he won 1/3 of the votes in Wisconsin, Indiana, and Maryland, and then he pulled out of the race. In 1968, he decided not to compete for the Democratic nomination. As an independent, he met the American Independent Party, he ran. And as late as the early fall of, we think about 1968 as this incredibly close election between Humphrey and Nixon. As you know, in the early fall, Wallace was polling at a level that suggested that he could easily win enough electoral votes with the Deep South and the Upper South in order to throw the election into the House of Representatives. Now, it turned out that the polling changed, but he got enormous crowds in Michigan, Wisconsin, and New York, which packed Madison Square Garden in late October of 1968. And the thing that's interesting about the election of 1968 is that if you put Wallace's vote together with Nixon's vote, you're talking about 57% of the popular vote. So already you can see, and it seems to me that in many ways, Wallace was establishing a path of ideas, a path of grievance, a path of anger, and a sense of what had gone wrong that Donald Trump was able to use very, very effectively. So, you know, in some ways you want to say, you know, who's an important predecessor? I would say, now 1972, I should say, but, you know, he was shot and he was forced from the race. But at that point, he had already won several Democratic primaries. And it looked like he was in a position to really, it looked like it was McGovern's year, but it could easily have been, they could have gone to the convention with Wallace as a really significant force. He was taken out, but I think it's important to see it.
The legacy continued. We're coming up to questions in a few minutes, and this book is so rich, so briefly, a two-part question. Because you cover the period, the post-70s to the 90s, and the ascension of neoliberalism, and this sort of Reagan-Clinton connection on policy around incarceration, around immigration restriction. And then you write about Bernie Sanders in 2016. Right. So if we could sort of move through both of those periods, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. One of the things that's really important for us to understand about illiberalism is that it's not simply an expression of a politics of constituencies. It's also an expression of politics and points of view of elites, right? And oftentimes liberal elites who indulge in illiberal policies or fashion what they think are liberal policies, but are always hedged in by illiberal fears of disorder being one of them. I think that, if you look at the 1980s and 90s, and especially, I wrote a chapter on neoliberalism, which is about Clinton. And it's about the war on crime, the war on welfare. Now think about this. Ever since LBJ, who first articulated a war on crime along with his Great Society, Now think about the language of warfare. Warfare means you're in a struggle that could have military components, and there's an enemy. And if you think about marking internal enemies, that's clearly where things were going, and you know who those enemies were. Had to do with people of color, African American neighborhoods, communities, inner cities that were seen as being unstable, that were seen as being threatening, that were creating disorder. Now, Clinton became a really central person, but this was bipartisan, of mass incarceration. And we have to understand mass incarceration not only is the expulsion of people from the communities where they live, but political expulsion as well. Because with the exception of a couple of places, people who are incarcerated have no political rights. And in fact, in most places, they can't regain their political rights when they're released. First of all, they have to go through parole, and then they have to pay back their debts. And in some systems, they're basically charged monetarily for their incarceration. So it takes them years and years and years for them to pay off the debts that they owe. And in Florida at the moment, there are nearly 1 million former felons who have been released, who have no voting rights. So it seemed to me that part of what was going on in this period was an expression of what happens when elites, liberal and otherwise, are faced with disorder, and how quickly they resort to the punitive hand of the government. And neoliberalism, the idea, was on the one hand using the state in the direction of deregulation, right? Freeing up the marketplace, re-expressing market values. And so theoretically, it seemed to be anti-government. And on the other hand, they were using the government to do that, but they wanted to use the government in terms of law enforcement and in terms of punishment and incarceration. So I think, if you want to ask, how did we, what is the process that led us to here, economically and otherwise? I mean, I really think neoliberalism and the enormous inequalities of wealth it created is very, very important. Now, when I think I mentioned yesterday that, the hardest chapter for me to write was the conclusion, because the book was so dark that I didn't want to end simply on a dark note. But on the other hand, I didn't want to seem like, well, I'm going to, save the country and here's what you should do. But I'm a historian. I have a hard enough time figuring out what happened before. I'm not very good at sort of policy making. But I will say, and I think I mentioned this yesterday, to me in 2016, the really interesting, remarkable thing that happened was Bernie Sanders. It was not Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump, I should say also that, thinking about America's illiberal past is thinking about a long road and a short road. The long road is how these ideas and practices and perspectives develop over time. But there's no inevitable outcome. I mean, Donald Trump is not the inevitable outcome of American illiberalism. He was a possible outcome. And then there's a short road to try to figure out, just like Hitler was not the inevitable outcome of social and political developments in Germany, Donald Trump didn't have, and look, he could have lost the 2016 election. That would have been the end of that, and where things would have gone, not entirely clear. But it seemed to me, here was Bernie Sanders, who was a self-proclaimed socialist. I mean, he wasn't someone who said, well, I'm not really a socialist, I'm kind of a left-wing Democrat. No, he was an independent politically. He won an enormously enthusiastic following, as has Orhan Mamdani in New York. And then, so the question is, now, I think the way in which the media deals with this is that they see the liberal tradition at the center of American politics and history, and people like Bernie Sanders, like the right wing, are kind of backlashes, right? I mean, there's sort of expressions of discontent, and somehow or other they'll be reincorporated or the like. They don't have a sort of integrity of their own. But I think Bernie Sanders reminds us that the American past is not just liberalism and it's not just illiberalism. It is a multifaceted political history. It includes socialism. It includes social democracy. It includes radical feminism. It includes radical abolitionism. It includes cooperativism, or what is known as producerism in the 19th century, a real populism that has been, now the term is used as an expression of rage. But no one who is called a populist actually calls themselves a populist. But in the 19th century, they did. So just to finish, my interest in this book is not in bookkeeping, was liberalism more important than illiberalism? It's not. It's to decenter liberalism, for us to recognize that this is part of the American political tradition. And the whole notion of a liberal tradition was kind of invented in the 1940s and 1950s. This was a new way of looking at the past. But by decentering liberalism, I think, we're at a point where we need to excavate our past more fully. We need to understand how people in times of crisis organize themselves, express their discontents, and imagined a future. And I think by simply seeing liberalism as all there is to offer, that our sense of the future is really much more constricted and not helpful at all. And so when Bernie comes along, who obviously appealed to Trump voters too for a while, then you have to think, look, there is this tradition that he's tapping into that goes back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, the left wing of the New Deal, and is more formidable than we would think.
Well, we have time for some questions, so please, are there mics?
That was awesome. Thank you
Thank
very much. I want to ask you about this modern trend towards what you could call monarchism. The Russell Vogt, Curtis Yarvin nexus.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I wrote a chapter in the book on the revolution and early national periods. Constitutional periods. And one of the points I try to make is that the American commitment to monarchism was very strong and really was central to American politics really up until the last moment, where in fact most Americans who were pushing back against the British were angry at Parliament. They weren't angry at the king. There was sort of this sense as if the king only knew. This is, this kind of naive monarchism, which is true of popular revolts. Slave rebellions usually begin with an idea that someone in a position of power is on their side. And if they only knew, or if the Tsar only knew, then he would come to our aid. And so I do think, as Tocqueville recognized, that there is nothing necessarily contradictory between articulating a notion of liberty and tying it to an idea of submission. You will submit to someone who is going to be on your side and support the liberty as you understand it. And I think that however much now we're approaching, yet another anniversary of American independence, however much, and I understand for political reasons, we want to say we threw off monarchism. Well, I'm not sure that that's really the case. Patron-client politics have been so important in American political history, and what we're seeing now with Trump, it may be unprecedented on the national level, but if you look at the state and local level, you see a lot more of these kind of, and look, let's face it, Christian nationalists, want to submit too, and they want us all to submit to the same, figure. So again, I do think that it's very easy to say that this country was built around a rejection of monarchy and that kind of political hierarchy, and I'm not sure that's true.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion, professors. My question kind of is about putting this in the global context. You mentioned that earlier, and some of the tendencies that we've been seeing in the past, I don't know, 20, 30, and so many years have also been happening in Europe and other places that would describe themselves as liberal democracies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, that's a great question. I think it really is important to recognize that however much, many observers try to talk about what's different about the United States, what's exceptional about the United States, that there's no way of understanding the history of this country from as far back as you can go, including indigenous histories of this country, without looking on a global level. And there's no question that I think we are in what I would call an international illiberal moment. I mean, illiberalism prevails in many, many places where it's not even prevailing in Europe. It's become a very important force, as you pointed out, in the post-war period, in part because of the Cold War. European countries built pretty substantial social democracies and safety nets, which have become increasingly undone as the empire struck back. People who were in colonized areas or, going back, where in some cases, like in France, they actually had, rights. And I think they feed off each other. Think about, Trump and Viktor Orban, who really is somebody who was associated with this idea of illiberal democracy and the idea of a certain kind of Christian nationalism. I think too, the American experience in the 1930s also needs to be understood in an international context because, the question is, this is a world of fascism and other forms of authoritarianism. There's no question that we can't understand the moment without recognizing that the executive branch of the American government has accumulated enormous power since the 1930s, and as we know, on occasion has really abused that power, lied to us, and so on and so forth. Now, Trump may be particularly egregious as far as this goes, but it's not something that he has invented himself. I do think, I think it's a really important point, and what is going to go on now, since he's playing an international game too, but look at Israel, look at India, look at, Argentina at the moment, everyone, there's a lot of rightward movement, Europe, the AfD in Germany, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a great question.
Yes, thank you. I think your book has made will make a great contribution. I would have to say that the idea of illiberalism contrasted with liberalism is in conflict with what you said before about where things may head, as in the case of Bernie. So that's just a comment, but just questions. Huey Long and Share the Wealth. Could you comment on that? I know that eugenics was supported by very liberal people in the interest of human perfectibility, and you see it coming back now in connection with DNA manipulation, artificial intelligence. Just your comments on those issues.
Yeah. Well, first of all, again, my point about Bernie, I guess, is to say that if we're thinking about the political world of the United States, it's not just liberalism and illiberalism, that, as I said, decentering liberalism in our thinking about what is important in American political history is a way of uncovering a whole variety of political influences. And you may raise a really interesting point about Huey Long. If you read the scholarship about Huey Long, there's a big set of disagreements. Is he a socialist? Is he a fascist? What kind of authority? I mean, Huey Long, controlled the state of Louisiana, but of course his policies were largely directed to punishing economic elites like the oil industry in Louisiana and trying to reward. Now, black people couldn't vote in Louisiana, but he had a pretty good following among African American Louisianans. And, he built schools and he built highways, and, his Share the Wealth program, which before he was assassinated was a potential challenge, to Roosevelt in some way of really capturing the kind of left wing in terms of policy of the New Deal. So what I would say is that he is part of an interesting political past. And to think about, well, this is Louisiana. I mean, we think of Louisiana as this really red state in a conservative sense. But Louisiana, historically, I mean, I'm sort of in the early process of doing a book on socialism and social democracy in the heartland. From the 1890s to the 90s, I mean, Milwaukee had socialist mayors into the 1940s, and I'm interested in Texas, Louisiana. The biggest socialist state was Oklahoma, Kansas, the Dakotas, Minnesota, the Farmer Labor Party, Nonpartisan League. So this is a past that's been erased, that we don't think about it anymore. So then the question is, how did when the red states were really red, right? And then, of course, what happened? So I do think that, again, coming to appreciate the diversity of America's political history and trying to excavate, a past that might at least speak to us. I'm not saying we have to reinvent the whole thing. I'm not saying we have to repeat. I don't think history repeats. It's like, as Mark Twain said, it doesn't repeat itself. I don't think it repeats itself. But nonetheless, there are these threads that have attracted enormous popular support. And they may be in areas and among people who we like to categorize. But politics is a very volatile process, right? And people who are boxed here at one point, and again, I'll sort of, I finished this book with an episode, and I'll kind of finish here, that takes place in a small county in Texas in the last decades of the 19th century, where because of economic challenges, a kind of insurgent movement of white people who were called greenbackers end up making coalition with African Americans who had mobilized themselves politically in the Republican Party. The head of the greenbackers family were Confederates. The head of the Black Coalition were formerly enslaved, okay? Little by little, I mean, it started as a kind of coalition of convenience, of opportunism, but little by little, they began to learn about each other. They began to recognize what different communities wanted and needed, that they won 30% of the white vote and almost all of the black vote, and they ruled the county from the late 1870s through the 1890s. First they were greenbackers, and then they were independents, and then they called themselves populists. And they even won elections in Texas called Grimes County when the Populist Party nationally was getting beaten. And finally in 1900, they were running again, and the local elites decided they had enough. And they formed the White Man's Union and gunned down the leadership, starting with the African Americans, but including the whites. And so this experience was completely erased. The White Man's Union was in charge of Grimes County into the 1950s. So this experience was totally erased. Okay, and it's something to think about.
Good. I'm glad we got to get there.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Okay. All right. Steve will be signing his book over in the tent. So we hope to see you over there. Thank you.